Today's daf in the Masechet Bava Batra is Mem Vav 44. We're moving quickly along, one daf a day. And yesterday, we talked about the Mishnah. So the Mishnah talks about people who do not have a chazakah, right? Now, this is not necessarily the same kind of chazakah of property, but we'll get into that later today. It's a chazakah. I'm trying to make a video. Well, you know what? I'm going to leave it off. Okay, I don't want to mess this up. Sorry. So the chazakah is basically, there are certain people, the Mishnah said, that are expected to have objects that don't belong to them. So though normally, if a person's wearing a watch, you assume it's their watch. And if someone else walks over them and says, that's my watch, and you can even prove that it used to be my watch, it doesn't matter, because the other guy wouldn't, or person wouldn't be wearing your watch unless you had sold it to them. But if you're a watch fixer, right, and you have someone else's watch, then it's very conceivable that the reason you have their watch is because they gave it to you to fix it. And so a person who fixes watches does not necessarily have a chazakah on a watch, meaning if it was Ruvain's watch and now the watch fixer is wearing it, Ruvain can say, you took it from me. Well, we discussed some of the parameters of that. So that person is not believed. So yesterday we had a machloket between Rabbah and Abaya. And Rabbah said, which is an unusual grouping, but Rabbah said that the only time that a person is not believed if you are a watch fixer, an uman is the word of the Mishnah, an expert, a watchmaker, yeah. But in this case, I said fixer mainly because it had to have once belonged to Ruvain, meaning, but okay, watchmaker we'll call them. And then one, but whatever item, we often use koves, as a cleaner and that kind of thing. So the only time that person has no chazakah is if two conditions are met, basically. If you have witnesses that basically the watchmaker has the watch, meaning it's not that Ruvain goes over to the watchmaker and says, I gave you a watch last week, give it back to me, and the watchmaker says, I don't know who you are. And the second one is that so that's in its hands. And the second is that you have proof that you once gave it to him, right? And Abaya disagreed. And Abaya said, you don't need to have proof that you once gave it to him. You just have to prove that he has your watch that was once yours. And if you can do that, he no longer has a chazakah because you assume that you gave it to him to fix and he's got to give it back to you. So let's read on the bottom now. We are 7 lines from the bottom of Mem Hey Amabet. So
why would you provide proof that you gave it to him? How does that ensure that that's your watch? Unless you gave it with the intention to fix it. If you gave it to him as a gift, it's his.
Correct. No, 100%. When Rabbah says give it to him, means give it to him to fix or give it to him to watch or whatever you gave it to him for, not to sell, not to buy. So Mativ Rava l'siyu l'Rabbah. So we are 7 lines from the bottom. Rava asked a question, and Rashi says, Rashbam, sorry, says, what do you mean he asked a question? What's the question? But Rashbam says this seems to be what happened in the Beit Midrash. That Rava was sitting there talking to Abaya, and he said to Abaya, I have a proof that Rabbah is correct. Mativ Rava l'siyu l'Rabbah. He brought a braya from a brayta to prove that Rabbah is correct. Because the brayta says the following. Hanotein talito l'uman. We had this case in the end of Bava Kama. Notein talito l'uman. You give a talit, you give a talit to a worker. So you give your shirt to the dry cleaner. Come at the end of the day to pick it up, and uman omer shtaim ketzatztali. And the uman says, you owe me $2. V'hala omer lo ketzatzi l'chela achat. What do you mean? I agreed to pay you $1. So how much do you have to pay? Now, the dry cleaner in this case is holding on to the shirt, right? So says the Braita in the end above the Mitzia, Kozman talit biyad uman. If the dry cleaner still has the shirt, then al habalabayit lavi ra'aya. If you want that shirt back, you think you only have to pay $1, you have to prove, you have to find evidence or a price list that you agreed to $1. But that's going to be our question, because the question here is, why can't you just say it's mine? And why do you have to prove anything? Like, why does the dry cleaner have any rights here? If you can see that the dry cleaner has it, right? According to Abaya, once you see that, you no longer assume that the dry cleaner owns it. So why do you have to prove anything? But we'll ask the question in a minute. Let's finish the break.
He has to pay him, though. He has to pay him the fee that the cleaner requests.
But that's not true. You can't hold on to my thing because I owe you money, right? Unless you prove it. Right, so it's not legitimate. You can't say this is mine, and you have to prove it. Anyways, let's read inside. Let's keep going. We'll get to the question in a second. So that's the first part of the Braita. Nuts nalo. Now let's say the dry cleaner gave the shirt back to the person, or the coat, whatever I said. And then the dry cleaner said, you owe me $2. And the guy said, I owe you $1. So then said the Braita in Bava Metzia, which is where we quoted this there, Bismano, if it's during the same day, remember you have to pay during the day, and that's where we introduced this there about paying on time, then Nishba v'notel. Then the cleaner can swear that you agreed to pay him $2 and collect $2. And we had a whole discussion about Metzia. This is one of the very rare exceptions where you swear and collect, right? Usually you swear that you don't owe money, you don't have to pay. But in this case, they allowed the shvua because they said that people who are picking up their garments from different stores are tarud, they're confused, they're overwhelmed, and they make mistakes, right? You get sent to the supermarket and the dry cleaner, you buy the carrots in the wrong place, right? And get your shirt in the other one. So that was what the Braita said in Bava Metzia. So we trust the dry cleaner who has, that's what they do more than the consumer. But that's only bismano. Avar zmano, if the day is up or the time is up, hamotzi mechaver alav haraya. So then the dry cleaner would have to prove that you own two. But now, the first case of the Braita said that if the dry cleaner is still holding on to the shirt, then the dry cleaner can say, give me $2 or I'm not giving you back your shirt. So hechidami. Now the Gemara is speaking. Last line of Daf Mem Hey Amud Bet. What's the case? Id ika edim, right? If there were witnesses that saw you give the shirt to the dry cleaner, then lichsi edim ma'ika amri. So say to the witnesses, you saw this guy give the shirt to the dry cleaner. What did they agree upon? What happened in that transaction? Elalav, it seems that deleka edim, that there are no witnesses that say that the person ever gave the shirt to the dry cleaner. So there's no prior sort of proof of that. And Katani and the Braita says, right, that in this case, uman meheman, that you trust the uman. So again, there's no witnesses that say that I gave him I don't have names here, but Ruvain, let's say Shimon is the dry cleaner. Ruvain says it's his shirt. So Ruvain goes to Shimon and says, give me back my shirt. Shimon says, okay, pay me $2. And Ruvain says, well, I agreed on $1. So there, because the Shimon, the Uman, is still holding on to the shirt, he has the power, right? So the Ketani, what the Braita seems to say is Uman meheman. Why is Uman meheman? Because migo di'ibay amale lekuchihi biyadi meheman. Because what Shimon, the dry cleaner, could have just said is, what do you mean your shirt? This isn't your shirt. This is my shirt. You once owned this shirt. I bought it from you, right? Which is why I have it. So it seems that he would be believed to say that, right? So Nami Agri, Nami Agri. So he's believed also about the money. Now the problem here is that according to Abaya, the dry cleaner has no migo because he can't say I bought it from you because he gets no chazakah in a case where you know he's a dry cleaner and you see that it's in his possession. According to Rabbah, it makes sense because according to Rabbah, the only time a dry cleaner has no chazakah is if you have edim that you gave it to him and you see that it's in his possession. And here you don't have edim. But according to Abaya, you don't need the edim. You just need to show that it's in his possession and he's known as a dry cleaner. So according to Abaya, why is there a migo here that you could say you bought it? And it's just, well, you're right. No, that's not the case. The case must be olam leka edim. There are no edim, right? But the case here is not where you know that it's owned by the dry cleaner. It's hu de lo ra'ah. There's a case. The case here has to be where you don't know the dry cleaner has not shown the shirt. Meaning, the guy went to the dry cleaner and said, can you give me my shirt back? And he said, well, pay me $2. The guy said, I'm only paying you $1. And the dry cleaner said, well, I'm not giving you your shirt. But nobody has shown, you haven't demonstrated that the shirt actually exists there, right? And so all Reuven can say, remember Reuven's the guy who originally owned the shirt, is I dropped my shirt off at the dry cleaner last week. But you have no proof of that. You have no documentation of that. And the dry cleaner denies the whole thing, in which case he has all the power. So he can just deny to give it to you until you pay him the $2. Now, if he's already given you the shirt, of course, he's out of luck. So that's the case according to Abaya.
Well, boy, how would he deny something that he's asking $2 for? How would he say I never saw the cloak, and then yet he's asking, I'm going to give it to you if you give me $2?
So deny, just to be clear, deny here means deny in front of witnesses. I mean, you could have this discussion between me and him, but when witnesses show up, he says, I don't know who you're talking. I never met this guy before in my life. Right?
Is a high burden for an uman to have witnesses every time they take a job?
I mean, according to A buyer, you're saying?
Yeah.
But they could have like receipts?
No, so just to be clear, so yeah, I mean, you have to have a structure. So you could have receipts, first of all, as Nava's point, which is why they have receipts. It's a little more complicated here because this really refers to the Rashbam, and Tosfos here says the exact same, agree in different ways, that we had earlier, if you recall, items that are commonly lended, right? Lent, I guess, or don't fall into this category. Right, you can't have a chazakah on those things. So it has to be talking about something which is not the most common thing to give, but is not the most uncommon thing. So it's like this middle ground. But certainly it's true that it's something that's very common. We have a different burden of proof. But as for Nachman, fourth line.
So he said, the Rashbam says, the Matzi Amar lo hayu devar me'olam.
Correct.
So he says, I never, but then if he says there was no sin, never happened, you never gave him anything, now how can he be charging him $2? Something he never got.
Between him, the two of them, they can argue all they want. When witnesses show up, he says, I don't know who this guy is, right? So the point is, if you haven't given it in front of witness, if your witnesses don't know that it's there, you might say, I went to the dry cleaner, my shirt was sitting right behind the counter. But then when you came back with the police, your shirt was no longer sitting there behind the counter, right? So then you have no proof. It doesn't exist.
Well, then the witnesses leave and he says to him, I'll give it to you for the $2.
Correct.
I mean, this could go on forever.
Exactly. It will
And he
go
brings
on.
the witnesses and they said, we don't have it. And then he comes back again. And he says, I'll give it to you for $2. There's no,
Which is why the Brita says you got to pay your $2. We're on the fourth line.
But the other point I'm thinking is that often you go to a store, whatever it may be, a car mechanic or a watchmaker. He gives you at the beginning. He said, it will cost you about $1, $2, but I can't guarantee that there may be other problems. So when you come to pick it up, he says, now it's actually $2. I estimated it to be $1, but it's really $2. You have to give me $2. And that happens all the time in any business.
One second, slow down before we get too personal and too practical. That it's true. That's not the case we're having, those, right? So the case here, the disagreement is what they originally agreed upon. That is a different case, right? If you left it open. Let's continue. We're 4 lines from the top. It's great to see everyone. Sorry, you don't see us. I'm just afraid our internet's a little too unstable. So we'll turn on the camera at the end to wave. But we are 4 lines from the top of Mem Vav Amud Aleph. Matav Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. As for Nachman bar Yitzchak, is a question on Rabbah. It said in our Mishnah. Now we're quoting our Mishnah. Uman ein lo chazaka. A person who's a worker who has an expert, maybe a craftsman, does not have a chazaka. Now the implication of the Mishnah is that uman hu de'ein lo chazaka, that because this person is a title of being a dry cleaner and he has this shirt, he doesn't have a chazaka, that it's his. But a different person in the exact same scenario, who's just not a professional, would be allowed to keep it. Ha'acher yesh lo chazaka. Now I don't get it. Hechidami, what's the case? Edim, right? If there are witnesses that say that Reuven came over to Shimon and gave this thing to Shimon and said, Shimon, please wash the shirt for me. Who cares whether Shimon is a professional dry cleaner or not, right? Shimon can't then say, oh, it's my shirt, I bought it from him. There's witnesses that Reuven gave it to him to wash or to clean. So why would another person who's not a dry cleaner have a chazakah in this situation? Elalav deleka edim. It clearly has to be a case where there were no witnesses that saw Reuven give it to Shimon. Vikatani, and the Mishnah says, Uman ein lo chazakah, implying that an Uman does not have a chazakah even when there are no witnesses. And that is a tiyufta de Rabbah tiyufta. Rabbah is clearly wrong, according to this end of our Gemara from our Mishnah. You don't need to have witnesses to say Uman ein lo chazakah. Even if there are no witnesses, a person who's known as an Uman can never claim, I bought this thing from you without proof, right? Now, so obviously, if you're an Uman and you want to start buying things, you better get a lot of good documentation for that. But the point is that usually you have a proof. You bought a watch, there's a sale that says you bought a watch. If I'm wearing a watch and I'm not a watchmaker, I can say the fact that I'm wearing the watch is proof that I bought it. But if I'm a watchmaker, that no longer is proof, and that's how we paskin like a buy it. Now, at the 2 dots, Tanu Rabbanan, let's keep going. The Brita says the following. Let's say a person goes, this happens all the time. That's we're talking about practical cases. You go to the dry cleaner, you pick up your suit, you get home, and it's somebody else's suit. Okay? Says the Brita, you're allowed to wear the suit. Until the dry cleaner calls you up and says, okay, come back and bring me that suit. I got yours. We're going to say in a second, because we assume what happened was the dry cleaner lost your suit, right? Happens all the time too. And they gave you a replacement from his own stock, not somebody else's suit. He has suits that he's on the side, maybe for this cause. He gave you a suit for you to use. But if it's bebeta avel or bebeta mishtef, you go to a shiva house and you pick up the wrong jacket, which also happens all the time, or you go to a wedding and go to the coat room and you get the wrong coat, then it's clearly a mistake. You can't use it. It's somebody else's coat, and you have to hold on to it, like any hashavat aveda. Find the person. Hopefully, you one day will recover your own coat too, and you'll get it. I'll ask the bright. I explained the answer because I gave it away. But Maishna Reisha, Maishna Seifa. What's the difference between the two cases? So I'm a Rav. Haviyativna Kamed de Chavivi. Says Rav, we used to sit in front of Chavivi. If you recall, Chavivi was Chia, who was Rav's uncle, because it was his mother's brother and his father's brother. So double uncle. V'amarli, and he said to me that from half marriages. Anyways, v'amarli, v'chein adam asui lomar le'uman macharli taliti. Right? Doesn't a person go to an uman and say to the dry cleaner, look, here's the wedding gown, right? Can you clean it and then sell it? Because we don't need it anymore. Or here's a fur coat, sell my belonging. And therefore, it's very likely that a dry cleaner has clothing that's appropriate for sale. And what happened here, presumably, is you gave your jacket to the dry cleaner. He forgot that it was yours or mistook it for somebody else's. Someone else gave their jacket and said to the dry cleaner, please sell my jacket for me. He sold your jacket by mistake, right? He realized the mistake when you showed up, and he felt a little embarrassed to tell you. So instead of telling you, sorry, I don't have your jacket, he said, take this one, and hoping you wouldn't notice. And he's going to go try to find your jacket back and reacquaint you with your own jacket. So it's a legitimate explanation. Amar Rav Chia, Reder of Nachman, said Rav Chia, Reder of Nachman, Loshanu Elahu. That's only if when you went to the dry cleaner, he came and gave you this jacket, and you got home and realized it was the wrong one. Aval ishto banav lo. Right? If his wife came to the door and said, here's the jacket, stop ringing, right? Or his children came out and gave it to you, then you assume that they just made a mistake, right? You can't make this whole assumption that he realized he lost your jacket, he gave you a different one that's legitimate. You have to assume it was a mistake, and therefore you cannot wear it until you clarify. Now, even the dry cleaner himself, or the person himself, we only said that you can wear the jacket. Ella de amrale talit stam. If the dry cleaner came and said, okay, here's a jacket, but avo talitcha lo. If the dry cleaner came to you and said, here's your jacket back, then clearly he's mistaken. He thinks that he's giving you your jacket, and he made a mistake. This whole ruse is basically, he realizes that he sold your jacket by mistake. He gives you one from his stock and to tide you over. But if he says, here is your suit, then it's not sufficient, and you have to assume he made a mistake, gave you somebody else's by mistake, and that's stealing. You're not allowed to wear it. The avatalitcha lo. But if he says, this is your talit, you cannot wear it because hi love taliti dehu, this is not your talit, and therefore you have to go and correct the mistake. That's a side point just about uman, not exactly our halacha chazaka. Now we are 6 lines from the bottom. Amalei Abaya l'Rava. Said Abaya to his friend Rava, Ta achvai lecha ramai de pumpadita my avdi. Let me tell you about these terrible villains of Pumpadita. The people in Pumpadita, they know how to get you every which way. Let me tell you what happens. Amalei, you go to the dry cleaner in Pumpadita and you say, Havli sarvulai. Give me back my, I don't know how we translate, sweater or coat or some object of clothing. And is he saying what it is?
Glimati.
Yeah, the response is taliti. But I'm not sure why we sometimes use talit or glima or sarvulai. But anyways, give me back my clothing. And Amarle, you know what the dry cleaners tell you in Pumpadita? Lahi dvarmi olam. We never met you before. What do you mean your beautiful suit? I don't know who you are. So you say to the dry cleaner, what are you talking about? Ha'itli sahadi the chazite gabach. I have witnesses who told me that last night your wife was wearing my fur coat, right? I saw your wife going around in it. So I have witnesses that saw you in possession of my clothing, of my sarvulai. Amarle, so the dry cleaner says to you, it just looked the same. Hahi achrina havi, right? It was another one, meaning all fur coats look the same. You made a mistake. All suits look the same. Not all. There was a blue suit. Right? It wasn't your suit. Now, even though you recognized it. So you say to the dry cleaner, well, why don't you bring the suit out that you were wearing yesterday, and we can check if my name is on the inside label or something, right? Afikne v'nichzinu. Take it out and we'll see it. Amarle, and they say to you, Ivra, no, the truth is, lo mafiknu l'cha, I am not, we don't know who you are. Get out of the store before I call the police. And that's how these evil guys in Pumpadita, are trickers, and so always get receipts if you ever give your dry cleaning in Pumpadita. That's the lesson.
Sarvalai is sort of a Persian word.
Okay, you heard Sarvalai is a Persian word, according to Rabbi Claudia from
Steinsaltz.
Steinsaltz, indirectly from Steinsaltz. I'm a Rava. Last line says Rava.
Wasn't
I
this a
don't really.
known thing? Wasn't there a call that the people in
That's what he's
Pavita
saying.
did this?
I guess this was like what the Yelp review, right? Abai is giving Rava the news about the dry cleaners in Pumpadita.
But wasn't there a call that people knew this is what they did in Pumbedita? And if so, they should have gotten a receipt or I witnessed Adim with them.
I can't. I was not around or present. I don't know the answer, but
It's like rivals between the Chosa
Yeah,
and Ardea. They're
hun-
always ragging on the other.
100%.
city.
Says Rava though to Abayo. I don't know what you're complaining about. I don't think they're wrong. If you just show up in a dry cleaner with no proof of anything and say, "Give me back my suit," that seems to be your problem, right? Shopper Carmele. It seems a little bit like they have a good argument, which is why didn't you prove that it's your suit? Says Rava, Ra'atanya, right? The whole example of our Mishnah and the bright that we had yesterday is if you see the person has your stuff, right? Here, it's not clear that that you saw. That's how Rashbam understands it. That here someone saw it yesterday, maybe, but you really have no direct proof that it's your thing. Here, you saw them wearing a blue suit that you think is yours, but the reality is that you can't prove that it's yours, and therefore it's not so inappropriate for these dry cleaners who probably deal with a lot of shady people to dismiss you without real further proof that it's yours. Amar Rav Ashi. Now, says Rav Ashi, when I heard about this story, I thought, if you're really a wise person, what you would do is mashvile, right? What you should do is you should make a situation where you can basically see it. Meaning you should come up with a situation where witnesses see that the dry cleaner has your stuff. Because once you see that it's there, remember that's where the Mishnah said there's no chazakah, right? And what do? The Amar, you know what you should do? You should go in private to the dry cleaner. You should say, look, between you and me, I know you have my suit. You know you have my suit. I understand. You don't want to admit that you have my suit because I owe you money or I borrowed money from you last year or I crashed your car last week. And you basically are holding on to it because it's your only leverage over me. Now, if you came to court and said he crashed my car, they would have a din and make me pay. So you are basically tricking everyone by denying you have my thing because you know that I owe you money. So say to the guy, which must be the case, to Amrla, you say to the dry cleaner, "Amai tefisa delay. Why are you holding on to my thing? Lav mishum to itli gabach, itlicha gabai. You have some claim on me, not necessarily related to the code, but for some reason why I owe you money. So here, listen, let's find out how much I really owe you and how much the suit is really worth. Hashta afiknu, take the suit out, vashaminu, and we will get two experts in suit value to evaluate how much the suit is worth, and they'll say it's worth $50. And then if I owe you 25, you'll give me, you take 25 from the suit and give me back, or if I owe you more, I'll pay you more. Shakol atidach leshkol anaditi. You take what I owe you, and I'll take my part. Now, of course, you're tricking him here because your point here is that as soon as these two, so to speak, experts, which you can't see my fingers because my camera's off, but you see, so to speak, experts, they are really witnesses, right? And then once they say, oh, we evaluate the suit is worth $50, you say, I'm not paying you a penny. And you go to court and say, I have two witnesses that my suit is at the dry cleaner, right? And once you got two witnesses, your suit is at the dry cleaner, he's got to give it back to you. So that says Rav Ashi, that's what I would have done. I would have done this trick to figure that out. Amalei Ravacha Braid Ravi Avia the Rav Ashi, right? Ravacha Braid Rav Avi said Rav Ashi, you've never dealt with dry cleaners before, right? He's never going to fall for that ruse. Motzaei Amalei, you know what he's going to say to you? Get out of my face. Lo tzarich l'shuma didach. I don't need you to tell me how much a suit is worth. Kvar shamu kamai dekamach. I already evaluated it before kamai dekamach is like a saying, before your elders, before the ones who came before you. Meaning I know what the suit is worth. Get out of here. I have no reason to do business with you, and I won't fall for that trick. Anyways, that's just a sort of public service announcement related to what we're talking about, and you should be very careful when you give your suit over in Pumpadita.
If they were used to selling suits, he's very right. If the dry cleaner sold suits for a living as well, he doesn't need someone else to tell him the value of a suit.
Right, it's true, and as we said, they did. Obviously that was part of the business, right? Is that you you would also sell. Anyways, let's continue. We're at two dots, 7 lines from the top. The next case we had in our Mishnah was Aris Ein Lo Chazakah. A person who's a sharecropper, does not have a chazakah, right? Usually a sharecropper gets an agreement with the owner. Let's say Reuven owns the field. Sharecropper Shimon comes and says, I will work your field. I'll keep half, right? We have different levels of sharecroppers. Let's say half, it's easiest. I'll work your field. I'll keep half the produce. You keep half the produce. Sharecropper works the field for 5 years. The owner says, okay, get out of here. And he says, what do you mean? I bought it from you 3 years ago. I've been living on this field for 3 years. I've been eating all the produce, 100% of the produce. You never stopped me. Says the Mishnah, you don't have a chazakah. Ask the Gemara, why? Amai. Why don't he have a chazakah in the case I just set up? Because ad ha'idna palga, right? When you were a sharecropper, you ate half. But for the last 3 years, you've been eating all the food on the field, and I didn't stop you. Hashtakula. Now, obviously, that has to be the case. Because if you're taking half the produce every year and giving it to the owner, you're clearly saying you don't own the field. So clearly for a few years now, 3 years is the minimum for chazakah, I didn't give you any produce and you never said anything. So why isn't that a good chazakah, even though I once was a sharecropper? Rabbi Yochanan, you're right. The case here is arisei batei avot, which is a fascinating category. There were arisim of the family, so to speak, meaning it was a hereditary thing in the sense that normally you can choose whoever you want to do your to do your plumbing, right? To fill your gas up every year. But there were certain relationships where it was always given to one family. And so essentially it was either a commitment or it was an unspoken commitment, but that one family were always the sharecroppers for your field. And in that situation, they didn't always settle up at the end of the year because these people are going to be working for you for generations. So for 3 years in a row, they kept all the food. And then the next 3 years, you'll keep all the food. So meaning that the agreements would extend beyond a year. They would go for multiple years. In that case, the fact that the sharecropper kept all the food for 3 years is not proof that they're a chazakah because they're a sharecropper. And so since they're a sharecropper, that's why you let them stay there. And so therefore, it's not a proof in that specific case. Says Rav Nachman.
So what right do they have to keep all the food? The agreement when he's a sharecropper, you're supposed to give half to the owner.
So either they made an agreement, unspoken, or he didn't, or that was just, they trusted each other enough that after a few years, they would make it all good. Amar Rav Nachman, said Rav Nachman, I just want to point out something. That even in this situation where you have a hereditary sharecropping thing, it's really, I say hereditary, but familial sharecropping thing, right? So let's say I'm going to give names here. Reuven owns the field. Shimon and Shimon's family have been working this field for 50 years, since his grandfather's time. And then Shimon sometimes keeps all the produce. But let's say, says Rav Nachman, Shimon said, I'm really too lazy to work on the field that I own the rights to, and I'm going to subcontract it to Levi, the third sharecropper. It's like if you own a taxi medallion, you give it out to the next person, which I think is very common, right? I'm not that familiar, but I think it's very common. So let's say, says Rav Nachman, Aris Shehurad Arisin Tachtav. Shimon, who's the prime Aris, prime sharecropper, hired or gave it to other, sublet it to other Arisim. And they live in the field for 3 years, and the owner never says anything. They keep all the produce. Says Rav Nachman, that's for sure a chazakah. Because yesh lo chazakah, my taima, a person doesn't just watch strangers who are not the family group go down to the field and start eating all their food for years after year after year and not say anything. So the fact that the owner did not make a macha'ah, as we had last week, for 3 years, it wasn't the sharecropper who he hired, even though it was by agency of that sharecropper, that's not the person you hired, and it is a true chazakah. But says Reb Yochanan, that's only true. It's only true if you didn't go at all. But let's say you hired people to work with you, right? So you have the what do they call it, like a tender or something? You have the agency to sharecrop all the fields of Ruvain for 50 years, right? And it's too much work for you. So you bring people with you, right? To do parts of it, to do one section or another section. Says Reb Yochanan, Aris shechalak da arisim, an Aris who distributes the field to many sharecroppers and works with them. Ein lo chazakah. There you don't have a chazakah. My taima emar harmanya ba'al mashavya. Because what the owner can say is, you were making it a harmanya. You were just making basically a collective. Trying to find a better translation, but that's a translation I came up with. The Rashbam's not so clear about what the word harmanya means, but it was with your permission is what he makes it sound like, your reshut. That meaning you were basically still had oversight over all these people. And so the fact is that even though it might have been that a different guy, Yehuda, worked one field for 3 years in a row and kept all the produce, I was dealing with you, Shimon. It was your problem. You were there. You were present. And I have a relationship with you. And therefore, you don't get a chazakah in any of that field.
He was the general contractor.
General contractor. Okay. We are 10
But
lines from
even in
bottom.
the case before that, now in this
Yeah.
case, he worked with him. But in the case, the previous one where this sharecropper, the Aris, sublet to somebody else, and we're saying that he has a chazakah, it's difficult to understand that because the owner had an agreement with sharecropper number one. And
but
there was and with the family of that, and there was no such thing as a chazakah. So the owner, after 2-3 years, he says to her, listen, I take my field back. And now the sharecropper one, sublet to sharecropper number two, he had no right to do that. And the owner should be able to go and take it from, like we've had other situations, the loan goes to this, that, and the other person is a lien on this. It's essentially like you could consider like a lien. He can go and take it from sharecropper number two because
so first of all, it's a great segue to our next sugya. We'll get to liens in a second. But that side point, again, the point here is that sharecropper number two, as you're calling him, lived on the field, ate the produce, sold it at his farm stand in front of the field for 3 years in a row completely. And the owner never got up and said, what are you doing? So what we say is that that's not believable. An owner would not have allowed someone, maybe 1 year, you don't want to deal with some mishugana, let him go on. But 3 years in a row, you will not allow a stranger to just live on your land. Now, if you hired that person to watch your land, to work your land, you'll let them live on your land. But if it's not the person you hired, and the person you hired is not part of the crew, then we say that's not reasonable. And therefore, we assume you're not the owner. So if the sharecropper number two says, what do you mean I'm a sharecropper? I bought it from you 3 years ago. I'm not sure what sharecropper number one says. So he was lost maybe. Sharecropper number two says, I bought it from you 3 years ago. Then he would be believed like any other chazakah. Now, Shalach le Rav Nachman bar Chisda, Rav Nachman bar Yaakov. Rav Nachman bar Chisda said to Rav Nachman bar Yaakov, Yilamdenu Rabbeinu, this is what we got into last week. Gets really complicated. So far, it's been a little more straightforward. The question of testimony. Right? Remember, we talked about testimony last week, and we talked about who's nogeya to who's related. So they asked the following question: Aris me'id o eno me'id? Can a sharecropper testify or not testify? Let's say, I'm going to use names. I sometimes get confused when I use names, so correct me, stop me if I'm wrong. Ruvain has a field, okay? He calls up sharecropping agency and says, I'd like a sharecropper to come work my field. And the sharecropper will come, Shimon comes and starts working the field. The next day, or 5 weeks later, there's a call to Beit Din saying, I, Levi, another person, I own a field and Ruvain stole my field from me. And Ruvain says, what are you talking about? I bought the field from you, right? So Ruvain has to now prove that he bought the field. He doesn't have a document, doesn't have a chazakah. Can the sharecropper Shimon testify on behalf of Ruvain, saying, I was there. I saw Levi sell it to Ruvain. Now, Shimon, of course, is involved in this field because he was hired by Ruvain. So the question is he considered to be nogea? He doesn't own the field. He's never going to own the field. But is he nogea to Ruvain in the sense that he can't testify on Ruvain's behalf? So that was the question. Aris me'id, can a sharecropper testify for the ownership of the field for the person who hired him? Oeno me'id. So Aviyativ Rav Yosef Kamei. So Rav Yosef was sitting in front of them when this question was raised. And Amarle said, look, I heard about this from Shmuel. Hachi Amar Shmuel, Aris me'id. I heard from Shmuel myself that an Aris is allowed to testify. The Aris, in this case, does not have ownership. He's not considered to be a Nogea party. He's allowed to testify. They said to him, what are you talking about? We have a bright of Atanya, Eino Meid. How could Shmuel have said that an Aris could testify? There's a Beferish Braita, which someone remembered, that says that Aris cannot testify. And so they answered, it must be that it depends on the circumstance. Lokashya, it's not a contradiction. Hadi'ika pera ba'ara. It depends on whether you have fruit in the ground, meaning that we generally think, the Rashbam lays out the principles, that in Aris, who is hired by Ruvain, does not have any allegiance to Ruvain, because it turns out that there was a good job market, and if you're a good Aris, you'll get hired by somebody. So you don't really care. If Ruvain loses the field and you lose your job, you'll go find a job with somebody else. And that's why generally an Aris is reliable, because they don't really care if Ruvain owns the field, right? However, if they already planted the field and it's the middle of the season, then remember, the Aris gets paid based on the produce. If Reuven gets kicked out of the field mid-season, the Aris gets nothing, right? So he's got a real big incentive for Reuven to keep this field till the end of the season. So there he's not reliable. So if there's Pera Ba'ara, there's fruit in the ground, then the Aris is not believed. But if there's nothing, or it's either the beginning of the season or the end of the season, and it's going to be relevant for next year, then the Aris is considered to be believed. Okay? So that is, we're 5 lines from the bottom. Let's continue because we have a few more minutes, I think.
Then he's
Everyone's still-
Nogea, but Devar, in the case
Then he's
there
right.
is.
Then he's Nogea, and he's not trustworthy because of that. But Tanura Banan, let's get.
If the field's taken away, would the sharecropper have to pay back what he ate?
So not after the fact, but you mean, what you mean if he ate like a year later?
Well, he worked for Shmuel, but Shmuel wasn't the owner.
Right.
And
you're
therefore
saying-
he ate Reuven's fruit without Reuven's permission.
So I'm not sure. It's a good question. You mean if, like he said, the last 10 years you've been living on this field eating half the fruit?
Even the last year,
Right.
this year you worked Levi worked the field, ate half of it, but it ends up this stranger Shmuel is a squatter and doesn't own the field, and you didn't
Right.
have permission from the actual owner to eat half the fruit.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure. I feel like I want to say he doesn't have to, but I don't know if that's 100% correct. So let me.
He also needs to be compensated for the amount of work that he did on the field.
Right, but
So
that.
who is going to pay him?
Right, no, so that's for the current year. But I'm saying he can always go back to Reuven and say, I worked for you for 10 years. Or a year, let's say, I didn't get anything. Right, but Reuven would not have any recourse, would have any resource to pay him. So I don't think you have to, but I'm not 100% sure. But let's continue. Tanur Rabbanan. The next case is the Braita, which is a very similar case, a rave, right? Let's say a person is a guarantor. So again, the way it works is that Nava wants to borrow money from me, right? And I say, Nava, I'm happy to lend you money, but what if you don't pay me back? And so I'm going to use Claudia here because she's sitting next to me. Claudia says, I guarantee the loan, right? If Nava doesn't pay you back, you can come collect from me, okay? So then a year later, right? A person comes and says to Nava, I lent money to Nava, right? Says to Nava, the field you're living on is stolen. And Nava has no proof. And she calls me up, assuming I'm not her father, and says, you were there, you saw me buy this field, come to court and testify that I own the field, right? Not me, Claudia, sorry. Actually, I got myself confused. I borrowed money from Nava, right? Nava's the lender. I'm the borrower, right? So I did it. Claudia is the guarantor. Okay, I think I said it a few different ways. So the guarantor is asked to come and testify that the field is really owned, right? So now the guarantor is really not a party to this field. They didn't buy and sell it. They don't own anything. But in one case, you might think the guarantor really wants the borrower to have a field, right? Because if the borrower doesn't have a field, and then when the lender comes to collect and the borrower says, I have nothing, right? Then you're going to go to the RA and you're going to collect from them. So it's in the RA's interest for the borrower to own the field. However, says the Braita, Arav me'id loveh, but an Arav is allowed to testify about a loveh, that their field is really owned by them, because even though it seems to conflict with the Arav, because says the Braita, v'hu de'itle ara achriti, and it's in a case where the loveh has other property, right? The loveh owns 3 fields, and this is their 4th field, right? They buy a lot of houses. So there, the Arav can testify about the 4th house, because although it's true, and Rashi Rashbam points this out, and Tosfos also discusses it here, that if, let's say, you lost all the fields, right, having a 4th field would be helpful. But the reality is that the loveh owns enough property now to pay off the loan, and we don't think about eventualities that are very far-fetched. So at this point, it doesn't really matter to the Arav if the loveh has more money or not, and therefore they're a disinterested party. So an Arav can testify even though they have a relationship, because as long as the loveh has other fields. And the truth is, it's not just the Arav, but it's even the malveh, meaning the loveh. Even the lender can testify to the loveh that they have a field, right? Again, it's very important for the malveh to know that the loveh has a field, because that's what they're going to collect from. But hudi itle ara achiti, that's where they have another field. So at this moment, it's not necessary for the malveh to say that the loveh has this field, because they have something else to collect from. And so therefore they're considered not relevant to the testimony. Furthermore, the 2 lines on the bottom, lokeach rishon me'id lokeach sheni. The same thing is true about a case where you have a first buyer and a second buyer, right? So again, the case here is Reuven is a big businessman, which means he has a lot of money and a lot of debts, okay? And Reuven's selling off property. So Reuven sells a field to buyer number 1, the Gemara calls Lokeach Rishon. And if one day one of Reuven's debts come to account, they're going to then go to Lokech Rishon to collect, right? That's when you buy a field from someone, it comes with the responsibility for all their debts, right? Achrayut, it's called. So the Lokech Rishon is going to have to pay that debt. Then the next week, Reuven sells the field to Lokech Sheni. Remember, there's an order of debts. You always collect from the first person who sold. So then if a debtor comes, they're going to collect from Lokech Rishon first. If there's no money at Lokech Rishon, they'll eventually collect from Lokech Sheni. So, says the Braita, the Lokech Rishon can be made Lokech Sheni, right? The first purchaser can be testify for the second purchaser because, right? Hu itle arachriti. That's because they have other property, right? So I said the backwards way, but you collect from Lokech Sheni. So therefore, it's as long as there's other property to collect from, even though in a far-fetched situation, it would turn out that you would go to collect from this person and it would help Lokech Rishon from not having to pay back their field. Nonetheless, because at this time, the borrower, right, the lova has other fields, you can testify about Lokech Sheni. The final case, we're going to read one more minute on the top of Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, is the case of Kablan. Now, Kablan is a little bit more complicated because the word Kablan literally means to accept. And what happened in a case of a Kablan is where let's use the case again, I'm lending money to Nava, but I really, I'm not so sure Nava is going to pay me back. So, because I happen to know a little about her finances. So she really needs the money. A third party, a Kablan, we're going to call, but that's what a Kablan, actually comes to me and says, I will not only guarantee that Nava is going to pay you back, but I will be party to the loan. And the Kablan takes the money from the lender and gives it to the borrower. And in that situation, although the document does say that I lent money to the Nava, the Kablan accepts not only secondary responsibility, but primary responsibility. I, the lender, can go and collect money from either Nava or the Kablan, right? So the Kablan, although they're not quite the borrower, they actually can be the first person you collect from. So says the Gemara, what about a Kablan, right? So Amrila Me'id, some say that they can testify for the borrower to say that her property is truly hers, right? Which seems a little bit far-fetched. We'll see why in a second. The Amrila Ino Me'id. And some say, no. A Kablan cannot testify about a borrower that they have property. What are the opinions? Amrila Me'id. Some say you can ka'arev dummy. You're like a guarantor. And of course, we have to be talking about a situation where Nava, the borrower, has other fields, right? So even if she didn't get this third field, she's got two other fields that the guy can collect from, right? The lender can collect from. And therefore, me giving her a third field doesn't actually change anything, right? But some say, Amrila Eno Me'id. You know why? Some say you can't testify because since the lender has their choice of who to go collect from, it's in my interest as a Kablan that Nava has more options for them to go to, because the more cars in Nava's garage, the less likely they are to come to me, right? It says, read that inside. You want Nava to have many fields here too, but two fields to collect from. When the Baal Chov comes and he says, look, I get to collect a debt. I can collect any of these fields in front of me. The fact that Nava has a greater number of fields to collect from is in my benefit as the Kablan. They're less likely to come to me. So in that case, even though she already has a field to collect from, unlike an Arev, we seem to conclude, that's how the Gemara seems to say, that a Kablan cannot testify because they are very, very interested in Nava having more fields, and therefore they're Nogea Be'edut, and therefore their testimony is not acceptable. So we will stop there, and we will continue gobbling tomorrow, fourth line from the top, at 7:45 a.m. in America, and whatever that is in Israel, 2:45, right?
Why wouldn't we have the same concern about the Arev, that the Arev would want multiple fields to choose the best?
Because you don't have the choice. So an Arev is a guarantor is not someone you can collect from if somebody has other fields, right? So that's the same. So the Rashbam goes, I left out some of the details because it's late at night on a Motzaei Shabbat, but the Rashbam goes into details about there's different quality fields, right? There's excellent quality, there's bad quality, there's middle quality. So normally a lender is allowed to collect from Benonit, from medium, right? We talked about this. But if you go to your borrower and they don't have any medium fields, they only have junk fields, you can't go to the Arev and say, I want a better field, right? You have to exhaust the options with the borrower before you get to the Arev. But in the case of a Kablan, you don't have to do that, right? And so therefore, in this circumstance, you want the Arev You want, sorry, you want the borrower to have more fields for that reason.
And the Arave doesn't care how many fields he has?
The Arave doesn't care directly. I mean, as long as you have one, then you have a minimum. Again, it's conceivable that you'll lose that field or that you lend money to 5 people, borrow money from 10 people. And, but we don't worry in baked in about very far-fetched cases. So that's considered to be very far-fetched.
But the Arave then it has responsibility to pay the debt.
Only if he doesn't have any fields, but he has
Right.
fields. So that's why you are allowed to testify. Okay, everyone, have a good night.
Happy birthday.
See you all in a few hours.
Shabbat tov.
Shavua tov.